Chris Martin. The name is echoing across global entertainment headlines once again, not because of a new Coldplay album or a record-breaking stadium tour, but because of one woman whose presence still seems to linger in his life, Dakota Johnson. While many assumed their relationship was firmly in the past, fresh whispers from inside sources suggest something far more emotional. Chris Martin is reportedly still struggling to fully move on from Dakota Johnson. And what's unfolding behind the scenes is far more intense than the public ever imagined. If you follow celebrity relationships, emotional breakups, and unfinished love stories, stay with this story until the very end, and make sure to join the conversation, because this is not just another breakup headline. Behind Chris Martin's public image as a calm, spiritual frontman who preaches love, healing, and unity, there is a deeply personal chapter that may not be fully closed. His long-term relationship with Dakota Johnson was famously private, carefully shielded from constant media exposure. But now, that silence is speaking louder than ever. Since reports of their split surfaced, one question has dominated fan discussions and entertainment media alike: is this truly the end, or just a pause in a love story that never found proper closure? Sources close to Chris Martin's inner circle reveal that Dakota Johnson's name still comes up in quiet conversations. Not in dramatic outbursts or public confessions, but in subtle moments filled with weight and reflection. Chris is said to reminisce about simple memories, peaceful nights at home, long conversations away from cameras, shared philosophies about life, purpose, and emotional growth. For him, Dakota was not just a partner. She was a safe place. And safe places are the hardest to leave behind. Dakota Johnson has long been known as one of Hollywood's most grounded and emotionally intelligent figures. Far removed from tabloid chaos, she carried herself with calm confidence, depth, and privacy. According to those familiar with their relationship, this emotional maturity was exactly what drew Chris Martin in. Their bond was never about public appearances or red carpet theatrics. It was slow, intentional, and deeply personal. And when a connection like that ends, it doesn't disappear overnight, it lingers. Fans have begun noticing subtle changes in Chris Martin's recent public appearances. During Coldplay performances, his energy has reportedly shifted. Songs about love, loss, and longing seem to hit differently now. Longtime followers of the band believe certain lyrics feel heavier, more personal, as if they are no longer just music, but emotional reflections of what he's experiencing in real life. Some fans even speculate that Dakota Johnson may still be the quiet inspiration behind his emotional delivery on stage. Midway through the year, a small but telling moment reignited speculation. Chris Martin was reportedly spotted at a private gathering attended by people from Dakota Johnson's close social circle. Although the two were not seen together publicly, his presence alone was enough to send fans and media into a frenzy. If he had truly moved on, many wondered, why was he still orbiting the same emotional universe? According to insiders, Chris Martin is not someone who cuts emotional ties easily. He is deeply introspective, often processing his emotions through music, meditation, and self-reflection. Dakota Johnson, in this context, is not a chapter he wants to erase, but one he is still trying to understand. This emotional complexity is believed to be the main reason why moving on has been such a slow and difficult process for him. Meanwhile, Dakota Johnson is said to be living her life quietly but steadily. Focused on film projects, close friendships, and personal balance, she has kept her private life firmly out of the spotlight. Still, sources suggest that the emotional history she shares with Chris Martin has not vanished entirely. While there are no public signs of reconciliation, the absence of bitterness, public statements, or social media drama speaks volumes. The mutual respect remains, and that alone keeps questions alive. This is where the story reaches its emotional peak. In an industry known for short-lived romances and explosive breakups, the story of Chris Martin and Dakota Johnson stands out for its silence and restraint. No dramatic interviews. No public accusations. No attempts to rewrite history. Just distance, memory, and unanswered questions. Is this the sign of a love that never fully ended, or the highest form of emotional maturity, accepting loss without destroying what once mattered? Pop culture analysts suggest that Chris Martin's difficulty in moving on is not a sign of weakness, but proof that the relationship was deeply meaningful. When two people grow together in trust and emotional safety, separation doesn't arrive as a clean break. It becomes an echo, quiet, persistent, and impossible to ignore. As the year draws to a close, attention is once again turning to Chris Martin's next steps. Will these unresolved emotions find their way into new music? Will Coldplay's future lyrics carry hidden reflections of Dakota Johnson? Or will this chapter remain a private journey, processed away from the spotlight? One thing is certain, Dakota Johnson's name still exists within Chris Martin's personal narrative, whether as unfinished love or one of the most significant emotional lessons of his life. This story serves as a reminder that behind the fame, the tours, and the headlines, celebrities are still human. Chris Martin, despite his global success, is still someone who loved deeply, and Dakota Johnson remains someone who left a lasting mark. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Do you believe Chris Martin still holds on to hope, or is he simply learning how to let go? Share your thoughts, engage in the discussion, and stay tuned for more exclusive updates, because this story may not be over just yet. And just when many believed the story had reached its quiet conclusion, new layers began to surface, layers that made it increasingly difficult to dismiss this chapter as fully closed. According to multiple industry observers, Chris Martin's emotional state over the past months has subtly shaped not only his personal life, but also his creative direction. Those closest to him describe a man who is not heartbroken in a dramatic sense, but deeply contemplative, moving through days with a sense of emotional aftertaste that never quite fades. Friends reportedly say Chris often revisits moments from the relationship not with regret, but with a sense of unfinished understanding. There is no anger, no blame, only reflection. This emotional tone has reportedly influenced how he approaches conversations, songwriting sessions, and even silence. In private settings, he is said to listen more than he speaks, absorbing rather than releasing, as if still processing something too complex to put into words. What makes this situation particularly compelling is the contrast between Chris Martin's public philosophy and his private reality. Known for advocating healing, forgiveness, and emotional awareness, he now appears to be living through the very lessons he often speaks about on stage. Insiders suggest that moving on, for him, is not about replacing Dakota Johnson or rewriting the narrative, it's about understanding why the connection mattered so deeply in the first place. Meanwhile, speculation continues to grow around Dakota Johnson's perspective, even in the absence of public statements. Her continued silence has been interpreted in many ways, but most commonly as an extension of her long-standing approach to privacy. Those familiar with her mindset suggest she views the past relationship as something meaningful, but not something to be publicly analyzed or explained. This restraint has only intensified public curiosity, fueling endless theories across social media and entertainment forums. Adding further intrigue, observers have pointed out that Chris Martin has made subtle lifestyle shifts that align closely with habits he developed during his relationship with Dakota Johnson. From the types of retreats he attends to the social environments he gravitates toward, the parallels have not gone unnoticed. While none of these details confirm lingering romantic involvement, they suggest continuity rather than closure, a thread still woven into his daily life. As discussions intensify, fans have begun revisiting past interviews, lyrics, and public moments, searching for clues that may have gone unnoticed at the time. Old Coldplay songs are being reinterpreted through a new emotional lens, with listeners questioning whether certain lines now feel prophetic rather than poetic. The idea that music can evolve in meaning alongside an artist's personal journey has given these songs renewed emotional weight. At the same time, industry experts caution against oversimplifying the narrative. They note that emotional attachment does not always equate to a desire for reconciliation. In many cases, especially with emotionally aware individuals like Chris Martin, difficulty moving on can stem from respect, gratitude, and the acknowledgement of a bond that genuinely shaped one's identity. This, they argue, may be exactly what audiences are witnessing now. As months pass, the lack of definitive closure continues to keep the story alive. No official confirmations. No denials. Just patterns, timing, and emotional nuance. And in a media landscape driven by instant updates and dramatic reveals, this slow-burning uncertainty has proven strangely powerful. It invites audiences to stay, to watch closely, to read between the lines. Toward the latter part of the year, subtle signs have hinted that Chris Martin may be channeling this unresolved emotional energy into future projects. Studio insiders suggest that recent sessions feel more introspective, more stripped back emotionally. Whether these creative shifts will translate into public releases remains unknown, but anticipation is quietly building. Fans are preparing themselves for music that may feel more vulnerable, more reflective, and more emotionally exposed than ever before. What ultimately sets this story apart is its restraint. In a culture accustomed to loud breakups and public reinvention, the quiet persistence of this emotional connection feels almost radical. Chris Martin and Dakota Johnson have not turned their history into a spectacle. Instead, they have allowed it to exist in its complexity, unresolved, dignified, and deeply human, and that may be why this story continues to resonate. It reflects a truth many recognize but rarely see represented so clearly in celebrity culture, that not all love stories end with clarity. Some end with understanding still in progress. Some end without anger, but with memory. And some, perhaps, never truly end at all. They simply change form. As attention remains fixed on Chris Martin's next public move, one question continues to quietly echo: is he holding on, or is he learning how to carry something meaningful without letting it define his future? For now, the answer remains just out of reach. And until it becomes clear, the name Dakota Johnson will likely remain a silent presence in Chris Martin's story, unspoken, but unmistakably felt. Stay engaged, share your perspective, and keep watching closely. Because in a world obsessed with endings, this may be one story that refuses to be neatly concluded. As conversations around this story continue to circulate, one detail repeatedly stands out among those who have followed Chris Martin's personal journey for years: his pattern of emotional consistency. Unlike many public figures who pivot quickly after a breakup, Chris has always been known to move slowly, intentionally, and with deep emotional awareness. This has only strengthened the belief that his connection with Dakota Johnson was not a fleeting chapter, but a formative experience that reshaped how he approaches love, vulnerability, and self-understanding. People within the music industry quietly point out that Chris Martin's past relationships have often coincided with periods of artistic transformation. Yet this time, the shift feels quieter, more internal. Rather than explosive reinvention, there is a sense of emotional refinement, an artist turning inward rather than outward. Observers describe him as emotionally present but reserved, as if carefully holding something precious rather than trying to escape it. This internal tension has become part of the narrative. Chris Martin is not portrayed as broken or lost, but as someone standing at the intersection between memory and acceptance. He continues to function, perform, and create, yet there is an underlying sense that part of his emotional world remains anchored to what he shared with Dakota Johnson. That anchor, sources say, is not painful in a destructive way, but heavy with meaning. What further complicates the story is the absence of a replacement narrative. There has been no high-profile romance, no sudden public displays meant to signal a fresh start. This silence has been interpreted by many as intentional. Instead of rewriting his story, Chris appears to be letting it breathe. And in an era where public reinvention often happens overnight, that choice alone feels significant. Dakota Johnson's continued discretion adds another layer of intrigue. Known for her thoughtful interviews and refusal to sensationalize her personal life, she has remained consistent in her approach. Those familiar with her perspective suggest she values emotional honesty over public explanation. She is not interested in shaping narratives, only in living her truth quietly. This mutual restraint between her and Chris has left the public without easy answers, which in turn has kept curiosity alive. Cultural commentators have begun framing this situation as a modern example of emotionally conscious separation. There is no villain. No dramatic fallout. Just two individuals who shared something profound and chose not to dismantle it publicly. For many, this has made the story far more compelling than any explosive breakup ever could be. As time goes on, subtle behavioral cues continue to fuel discussion. Chris Martin's interviews have grown more reflective. His language around love, impermanence, and connection carries added depth. While he avoids direct references, the emotional themes are unmistakable. Fans listening closely hear echoes of personal evolution rather than heartbreak, a sign that he may not be clinging to the past, but carefully integrating it. Yet even emotional growth does not erase attachment overnight. Psychologists often note that deeply secure bonds do not dissolve cleanly. They transform. And this transformation can look, from the outside, like an inability to move on, when in reality, it may be a form of emotional respect. Chris Martin's journey appears to align with this understanding. He is not resisting change, he is honoring what once was. As speculation continues, some fans hold on to the idea of reconciliation, while others believe the story is already complete, just not in a conventional way. Both interpretations coexist, feeding endless discussion across platforms. And without confirmation from either side, the narrative remains open-ended, suspended between past and future. What remains undeniable is the impact of this relationship on public perception. Chris Martin, often seen as spiritually centered and emotionally evolved, is now viewed through a more human lens. Someone capable of deep love, deep connection, and deep reflection. Dakota Johnson, meanwhile, continues to be admired for her composure and emotional intelligence. Together, even apart, they represent a kind of quiet authenticity rarely seen at this level of fame. As the story continues to unfold without headlines or declarations, its power lies in its subtlety. There is no rush toward resolution. No urgency to define the ending. Just time, distance, and the slow reshaping of emotional truth, and perhaps that is the real payoff of this story. Not whether Chris Martin and Dakota Johnson will ever reunite, but what their silence teaches about love that mattered. Love that didn't burn out in chaos, but softened into memory. Love that doesn't demand closure, but understanding. For now, Chris Martin continues forward, carrying success, creativity, and an emotional chapter that still resonates beneath the surface. And Dakota Johnson remains a name that surfaces not in scandal, but in reflection. Whether this chapter reopens or quietly fades, one thing is certain: this was not a love easily forgotten. Stay connected, keep the conversation alive, and share your perspective. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't the ones that end loudly, but the ones that linger long after the final word is spoken. As the narrative surrounding Chris Martin and Dakota Johnson continues to evolve, new interpretations are emerging, less about romance in the traditional sense, and more about emotional legacy. Industry insiders now describe Chris Martin as someone living in a state of emotional clarity mixed with quiet longing. Not longing for the past to return exactly as it was, but for the meaning it once held. This distinction matters, because it reframes the story from heartbreak to transformation. Those close to Chris suggest that what makes this process so prolonged is not denial, but depth. He is reportedly someone who believes that relationships leave permanent imprints, especially when they are built on trust, privacy, and emotional safety. Dakota Johnson, in that sense, is not a memory he is trying to erase. She is part of a foundation that shaped his emotional worldview in recent years. Letting go of that foundation does not happen quickly, nor does it need to. Observers have also noted that Chris Martin's recent creative decisions appear more intentional and less performative. There is a noticeable absence of distraction. He is not chasing public validation, nor attempting to prove emotional independence. Instead, he seems focused on alignment between who he is publicly and what he feels privately. This alignment, according to those who know him, was something he valued deeply during his time with Dakota Johnson. As weeks turn into months, the public continues to search for definitive signs, an interview, a lyric, a gesture, that might finally clarify the status of his emotional world. But clarity has not arrived in obvious ways. Instead, it appears in tone, pacing, and restraint. Chris Martin speaks more slowly now. He pauses more. He chooses words carefully. These subtle shifts have not gone unnoticed by longtime fans, many of whom believe they signal a man still processing something meaningful. Dakota Johnson's absence from the narrative remains just as powerful as Chris's presence within it. She has neither fueled speculation nor shut it down. Her approach has been consistent with her long-held belief that personal truth does not require public explanation. Those familiar with her mindset suggest that she views the past relationship with gratitude rather than regret, and that this emotional maturity may be exactly why the bond still resonates so strongly on both sides. Media analysts have begun calling this one of the most quietly compelling celebrity stories in recent years. Not because of scandal or surprise, but because of its emotional realism. In an industry that often rewards dramatic endings, this story unfolds in whispers. It resists simplification. It invites interpretation rather than conclusions, and then there is the question that keeps resurfacing: what happens when love ends without conflict? When there is no betrayal, no explosion, no public reckoning? Experts argue that these endings are often the hardest to process. Without a clear emotional break, the mind continues to revisit the connection, searching for meaning rather than closure. This, they say, may explain why Chris Martin's journey appears ongoing rather than resolved. Some fans believe the music will eventually tell the rest of the story. Coldplay has long been known for emotionally resonant songs that blur the line between the personal and the universal. If new material emerges carrying themes of acceptance, reflection, and quiet endurance, many will inevitably link it back to this chapter of his life. Not as confession, but as evolution. Others, however, believe that this story may never receive a public conclusion, and that may be intentional. Chris Martin has often spoken about living fully in the present, even while honoring the past. Carrying memory without being consumed by it. Loving without possession. Letting go without erasure. These philosophies now feel less like abstract ideas and more like lived experience. As attention continues to circle around him, Chris Martin remains composed, grounded, and unmistakably human. He has not denied the emotional weight of the past, nor has he dramatized it. Instead, he seems to be allowing time to do what it does best: reshape understanding. Dakota Johnson, meanwhile, continues forward with the same quiet strength that defined her presence throughout the relationship. She remains admired not only for her talent, but for her emotional boundaries. In a culture that demands access, her restraint feels increasingly rare. Together, their story stands as a reminder that some connections do not end in rupture, but in resonance. They fade slowly, echoing through memory, creativity, and growth. And perhaps that is why this narrative refuses to disappear. It is not about reunion or finality. It is about impact. As the public waits, watches, listens, the silence itself becomes the message. A message about love that mattered. About separation without destruction. About the courage it takes to move forward without pretending the past didn't exist. Whether Chris Martin will one day speak openly about this chapter remains unknown. Whether Dakota Johnson will ever address it publicly is equally uncertain. But until then, their shared history continues to live quietly between the lines, felt more than seen, understood more than explained, and maybe that is where this story finds its true power. Not in answers, but in authenticity. Not in resolution, but in reflection. Because some stories are not meant to end sharply. Some are meant to linger, softly, honestly, and unmistakably real. As time continues to pass, the narrative surrounding Chris Martin grows less about speculation and more about emotional continuity. Those who observe him closely describe a man who has not closed a door, but gently leaned it shut, aware that what lies behind it still matters. This distinction has become central to how many interpret his current state. He is not stuck in the past, yet he is not rushing toward emotional replacement either. Instead, he appears to be living within the in-between, a space that feels unfamiliar to an industry obsessed with reinvention. Several people from Chris Martin's extended circle have quietly suggested that the emotional bond he shared with Dakota Johnson altered his understanding of partnership in lasting ways. The relationship reportedly reshaped his sense of intimacy, reinforcing the idea that love does not need to be loud to be profound. That realization, once experienced, cannot simply be undone. It changes the baseline. And when the baseline changes, moving forward requires recalibration rather than escape. This recalibration has been visible in subtle patterns. Chris Martin's public demeanor remains warm and open, yet noticeably more contained. He laughs, engages, performs, but there is an added layer of introspection beneath the surface. Fans who have followed his journey for decades say this is not sadness, but depth. A depth that often emerges after experiencing something genuinely transformative. The media's fascination persists precisely because there is no obvious narrative turn. No scandal has replaced the story. No new romance has redirected attention. Instead, the emotional residue remains present, quietly resisting erasure. In an age of rapid cycles and short attention spans, this lingering presence feels almost defiant. It forces audiences to slow down and sit with emotional ambiguity. Dakota Johnson's continued distance from public commentary reinforces this tone. Her refusal to engage with speculation has not weakened interest, it has strengthened it. By choosing not to clarify, she allows the story to exist without manipulation. Those who admire her approach argue that this silence is not avoidance, but self-respect. And in that restraint, she mirrors the emotional maturity often attributed to Chris Martin himself. Some cultural observers have gone so far as to describe this as a case study in modern emotional intelligence. Two high-profile individuals choosing privacy over performance, respect over narrative control. The result is not confusion, but fascination. Because when emotions are not explained, they invite reflection rather than judgment. As discussions evolve, the focus has begun to shift toward legacy rather than outcome. What does this relationship leave behind? Not in terms of reunion or final statements, but an emotional influence. For Chris Martin, the answer appears to lie in how he carries himself now, with increased sensitivity, patience, and depth. For Dakota Johnson, it lies in her continued commitment to emotional boundaries and authenticity. There is also a growing sense that the public may never receive the closure it expects. And perhaps that is intentional. Not every story exists to be resolved on demand. Some unfold privately, reshaping those involved without requiring an audience. This reality challenges the assumptions of celebrity culture, where access is often mistaken for entitlement. As the months stretch on, Chris Martin's journey continues quietly. He remains productive, creative, and engaged with the world, yet unmistakably changed. The emotional imprint of his past relationship has not disappeared, it has integrated. And integration, unlike erasure, allows growth without denial. Observers note that this may ultimately be the most honest form of moving on. Not forgetting, not replacing, but carrying forward with awareness. Allowing love to have existed without insisting it must continue or be explained. Dakota Johnson's name still surfaces in conversations not because of drama, but because of significance. Because some connections leave marks that do not fade easily. And those marks do not demand action, they simply exist, shaping how one loves, listens, and lives afterward. As public interest remains steady, the absence of definitive answers continues to fuel engagement. Viewers listen more closely. Fans analyze tone rather than statements. Silence becomes content. And in that silence, the story grows richer rather than weaker. Perhaps that is the final tension of this narrative. Not whether Chris Martin will move on, but whether moving on has already begun, just not in the way people expect. Maybe it is happening quietly, internally, without spectacle. Maybe it is unfolding through acceptance rather than replacement, and so the story remains open. Not unresolved, but unforced. A reflection of love that mattered enough to change someone, but not enough to imprison them. A reminder that the most powerful endings are not always loud. As long as Chris Martin continues forward with grace, and Dakota Johnson continues living with quiet integrity, their shared past will remain exactly where it belongs, not as gossip, but as a meaningful chapter that shaped who they are today. And for those watching closely, listening carefully, and reading between the lines, one truth becomes increasingly clear: some love stories don't end with a goodbye. They end with understanding still